Marcus Rodriguez had always been careful about his appearance. At 34, he worked as a marketing executive for a prestigious firm in downtown Chicago, where pressed suits and polished shoes were the uniform of success. His colleagues knew him as the guy who never missed a deadline, always had the perfect presentation, and could charm any client with his warm smile and quick wit. What they didn't know was that beneath his carefully pressed white shirts lay a secret that had haunted him for over 15 years. The tattoo stretched across his left shoulder blade, an intricate design of a skull with wings spread wide, surrounded by roses and thorns. Below it, in Gothic lettering, were the words, "Death's Angel," a reminder of a life he had desperately tried to leave behind. Marcus had gotten the tattoo when he was 18, fresh out of juvenile detention and running with a gang that controlled 3 blocks of the South Side. Back then, it had been a badge of honor, a symbol of belonging to something bigger than himself, even if that something was dangerous and destructive. Now, as he stood in his apartment bathroom each morning, Marcus would catch glimpses of the tattoo in the mirror and feel the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He had built an entirely new life, complete with a college degree earned through night classes, a respectable career, and a small circle of friends who saw him as Marcus the professional, not Marcus the former gang member. The tattoo was the only physical evidence of his past, and he guarded it like a state secret. His morning routine was precise and calculated. Long-sleeve shirts even in the sweltering Chicago summers, strategic positioning at the gym to avoid changing in front of others, and careful selection of restaurants and bars where he could keep his jacket on without drawing attention. Marcus had become a master of misdirection, always finding excuses to avoid situations where his upper body might be exposed. The closest call had come 2 years earlier during the company's annual retreat. The team had gone to a resort in Wisconsin, and everyone was expected to participate in team-building activities that included swimming and beach volleyball. Marcus had feigned a shoulder injury from a recent tennis match and spent the weekend in long sleeves, claiming he was protecting a pulled muscle. His colleagues had been sympathetic and the lie had worked perfectly. But the stress of maintaining the deception for an entire weekend had left him exhausted and paranoid. At work, Marcus had cultivated relationships carefully, always maintaining just enough distance to avoid intimate friendships while still being well-liked and respected. His supervisor, Janet Morrison, often praised his dedication and attention to detail, never suspecting that much of his meticulousness came from the constant need to manage his image. His office was positioned strategically near the elevator, allowing him to keep his suit jacket on during most interactions and avoid the casual, relaxed atmosphere of the break room where people might notice his consistent refusal to roll up his sleeves. The weight of the secret had grown heavier over the years. Marcus had considered laser removal multiple times, researching procedures and costs, but the tattoo was large and dark, and doctors had warned him that complete removal would take years and might leave significant scarring. The irony wasn't lost on him that removing evidence of his past might create new evidence that would be equally difficult to explain. He had also looked into cover-up tattoos, but finding an artist he could trust with his story felt impossible, and the risk of word getting out in Chicago's interconnected professional circles was too great. Dating had become another minefield to navigate. Marcus had been in a few relationships over the years, but each one had ended when the pressure of maintaining his secret became too overwhelming. Women would comment on his reluctance to be physically intimate or his insistence on keeping shirts on, and rather than risk exposure, he would find ways to end the relationships before they deepened. The loneliness was crushing, but it felt safer than the alternative. His family knew about his past, of course, but they had moved to Phoenix 5 years earlier when his father retired. During their visits to Chicago or his trips to see them, the tattoo was never discussed. It existed in a strange limbo of acknowledged but unspoken family history. His mother would sometimes look at him with a mixture of pride and sadness, understanding the burden he carried but respecting his choice to handle it privately. The gang he had been part of was largely disbanded now. Some members had been imprisoned, others had moved away or died, and a few had managed to build new lives like Marcus had. He occasionally heard updates through old neighborhood connections, but he had severed those ties almost completely. The clean break had been necessary for his transformation, but it also meant he carried the weight of his secret alone. Marcus had developed elaborate contingency plans for various scenarios, If he ever needed emergency medical care, he had researched hospitals where he was unlikely to encounter colleagues. He kept a gym bag in his car with extra shirts in case of unexpected spills or situations where changing clothes became necessary. His apartment lease included a private entrance specifically so he could exercise at home without risk of exposure in communal fitness areas. The psychological toll was constant but manageable, like a low-grade fever that never quite broke. Marcus had learned to compartmentalize his anxiety, channeling it into professional excellence and community involvement. He volunteered with literacy programs in neighborhoods far from his office, finding satisfaction in helping kids who reminded him of his younger self, though he was careful never to share details of his own background. As summer approached once again, Marcus felt the familiar dread settling in. Company picnics, client golf outings, and casual Friday policies would test his carefully constructed defenses. He had already begun planning his excuses and strategies, mapping out the social calendar like a military campaign. But as he stood in his bathroom that morning, adjusting his collar one more time, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his luck was running out. The secret that had protected his new life was becoming the very thing that might destroy it. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning that seemed no different from any other. Marcus was preparing for the quarterly client presentation, a high-stakes meeting with Peterson Industries that could secure the biggest contract in his firm's history. He had spent weeks perfecting the pitch, coordinating with his team and ensuring every detail was flawless. The presentation was scheduled for Thursday, giving him 2 days to make final adjustments and prepare for what could be the defining moment of his career. Sarah Chen, the firm's newest junior executive, had been assigned to assist Marcus with the Peterson project. She was brilliant, ambitious, and had already impressed everyone with her innovative marketing strategies. Marcus appreciated her dedication and sharp instincts, but her enthusiasm for team bonding made him nervous. Sarah was the type of person who organized happy hours, suggested group workout sessions, and believed that strong professional relationships required personal connections. "Marcus, you're always so formal," Sarah had commented the previous week while they worked late on the Peterson materials. "You should come to my yoga class sometime. It's great for stress relief and the instructor is amazing." Marcus had deflected with his usual excuse about a chronic shoulder condition that made certain exercises inadvisable, but he could see the curiosity in Sarah's eyes. She was too perceptive for her own good, and Marcus worried that his careful facade was beginning to show cracks. The Peterson presentation required a full multimedia setup in the firm's main conference room, complete with projection screens, sound system, and tiered seating for the client's executive team. Marcus arrived early Thursday morning to oversee the technical preparations, dressed in his sharpest navy suit and feeling confident about the pitch. The room was buzzing with activity as technicians tested equipment and catering staff arranged refreshments. At 10:30, the Peterson team arrived. James Peterson himself led the group, an imposing man in his 60s who had built his manufacturing empire through shrewd business decisions and an eye for innovative marketing. His entourage included his daughter Victoria, who served as vice president of operations, and 3 other senior executives. Marcus greeted them professionally, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries while Janet Morrison handled the formal introductions. The presentation began flawlessly. Marcus guided the Peterson team through their comprehensive marketing strategy, highlighting demographic analysis, digital campaign concepts, and projected return on investment. His slides were polished, his delivery was smooth, and he could see approval in the clients' faces. Victoria Peterson asked several insightful questions about target market penetration, and Marcus answered each one with confidence and supporting data. 40 minutes into the hour-long presentation, disaster struck in the most unexpected way. Marcus was demonstrating a particularly complex point about consumer behavior patterns when the wireless presentation remote malfunctioned. The slide stopped advancing and the screen froze on a graph that was only half of the intended display. He pressed the buttons repeatedly, but the device remained unresponsive. "I apologize for the technical difficulty," Marcus said smoothly, maintaining his professional demeanor. "Let me manually advance the presentation from the laptop." He moved toward the front of the room where the computer was positioned on a small table beside the projection screen. As he leaned over to access the keyboard, He felt a sharp tug at his jacket sleeve. The sleeve had caught on the corner of the table, and as Marcus straightened up to free it, he heard the unmistakable sound of fabric tearing. His suit jacket had ripped along the shoulder seam, creating a gaping hole that exposed his white dress shirt underneath. The tear was significant, running from his shoulder blade down toward his armpit, and the damaged fabric hung awkwardly. "Oh no," Sarah gasped from her position near the back of the room. "Marcus, your jacket is torn." All eyes in the room turned to him, and Marcus felt a surge of panic. The tear was large enough that continuing the presentation while wearing the damaged jacket would be impossible, but removing it would expose exactly what he had spent 15 years trying to hide. "It's fine," Marcus said quickly, attempting to hold the torn fabric in place with his arm pressed against his side. "I can manage the rest of the presentation like this." But even as he spoke, he knew the solution was impractical. The torn jacket looked unprofessional, and the way he was contorting his body to hide the damage was drawing more attention than if he simply removed it. James Peterson, ever the pragmatist, waved his hand dismissively. "Son, just take the jacket off. We're all adults here, and I'd rather hear your presentation clearly than watch you struggle with damaged clothing." The other executives nodded in agreement, and Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. "Really?" "I'm fine," Marcus insisted, but his voice sounded strained even to his own ears. The room had grown uncomfortably warm, and he could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Sarah approached with a concerned expression, clearly wanting to help but unsure how to proceed. "Marcus, you're being ridiculous," Victoria Peterson said with a laugh. "It's just a shirt underneath. Take off the jacket and finish your presentation. We're here to discuss business, not judge your wardrobe." Her tone was friendly but firm, the voice of someone accustomed to making practical decisions quickly. Janet Morrison stepped forward, recognizing the unusual situation but wanting to keep the client meeting on track. "Marcus, why don't you step out for a moment and see if building maintenance has a spare jacket or sweater you could borrow?" It was a reasonable suggestion, but Marcus knew that leaving the room would derail the entire presentation and potentially cost them the contract. The Peterson team was becoming restless, exchanging glances and checking their watches. Marcus could see their patience wearing thin, and he realized that his continued reluctance to simply remove the damaged jacket was creating exactly the kind of scene he had spent years trying to avoid. The irony was crushing. His effort to hide his secret was drawing far more attention than the secret itself would have. "You know what?" James Peterson said, his tone shifting slightly toward impatience. "We have a tight schedule today. Either take off the jacket and continue, or we'll need to reschedule this meeting for another time when you're better prepared." The ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus understood that the contract, his career advancement, and his carefully constructed professional reputation all hung in the balance. Sarah moved closer, her voice gentle but urgent. "Marcus, seriously, just take it off. Everyone here has seen a dress shirt before." She reached toward his arm as if to help him remove the jacket, and Marcus instinctively pulled away, his movement sharp and defensive. The action created an uncomfortable silence in the room. Marcus stood frozen, one arm still pressed against his torn jacket, his face flushed with anxiety and embarrassment. The Peterson team stared at him with a mixture of confusion and growing suspicion, clearly wondering why a grown man was so adamant about keeping on a damaged piece of clothing. It was Victoria Peterson who finally broke the silence, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern. "Are you injured? Is there something wrong with your arm or shoulder?" Her question was innocent, motivated by what appeared to be medical distress, but it only intensified Marcus's dilemma. Marcus realized that the moment of truth had arrived, 15 years ahead of schedule. The silence in the conference room stretched for what felt like an eternity, though in reality it lasted only a few seconds. Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to disaster. He could feel the weight of everyone's stares, the growing confusion and impatience of the Peterson team, and the concerned looks from his own colleagues. The torn jacket felt like a spotlight, drawing attention to the very thing he had spent years concealing. "I'm not injured," Marcus finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The admission seemed to confuse the situation even more, as the obvious question became why a healthy professional would refuse to remove a damaged piece of clothing during an important business meeting. He could see Janet Morrison's brow furrow with concern and bewilderment, while Sarah's expression shifted from helpfulness to genuine worry. James Peterson's patience had clearly reached its limit. "Look, son, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but we came here for a business presentation, not a psychological drama. Either conduct yourself professionally, or we're leaving." His tone carried the authority of a man who had built an empire by making quick decisions and not tolerating nonsense. The ultimatum hit Marcus like a physical blow. The Peterson contract represented months of work, not just for him but for the entire team. Sarah had contributed innovative ideas, Janet had invested significant political capital in securing the meeting, and the firm's reputation was on the line. His personal secret was about to destroy professional relationships and potentially cost people their jobs. Victoria Peterson stood up, clearly preparing to leave. "Dad, I think we should go. Something's obviously wrong here, and we can't make business decisions in this kind of environment." The other executives began gathering their materials, and Marcus watched his career imploding in real time. "Wait," Marcus said, his voice stronger now but carrying a note of desperation. "Please don't leave. I can explain." But even as he spoke, he realized he had no idea how to explain anything without revealing everything. The room paused, giving him one final opportunity, but the pressure felt overwhelming. Sarah stepped closer, her concern overriding professional boundaries. "Marcus, what's going on? You're scaring me. Are you having some kind of medical emergency?" Her genuine worry touched something in Marcus that his professional fears couldn't reach. She wasn't trying to expose him or damage his career. She was simply a colleague who cared about his well-being. "It's not medical," Marcus said quietly, looking down at the floor. "It's complicated." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, acknowledging that the situation had moved beyond his control and into territory where his carefully maintained secrets would no longer hold. James Peterson sat back down, his business instincts recognizing that something significant was happening. "Complicated how?" "Look, we're all adults here. Whatever it is, just tell us so we can move forward." His tone had shifted from impatience to curious concern, the voice of someone who had navigated enough human complexity to recognize genuine distress. Marcus felt the walls of his constructed identity beginning to crumble. 15 years of careful image management, strategic positioning, and calculated deception were about to collapse because of a torn jacket and a presentation remote that wouldn't work. The irony was almost laughable, except that nothing about the situation felt amusing. "I have a tattoo," Marcus said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "On my shoulder. It's from a long time ago, from before I was the person I am now, and I've spent years making sure no one here would ever see it because I was afraid of what people would think." The confession felt both liberating and terrifying, like jumping from a burning building without knowing if there was a safety net below. The room remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. Instead of confusion and impatience, there was now curiosity and something that might have been understanding. Victoria Peterson raised an eyebrow but didn't seem shocked or appalled. Janet Morrison's expression shifted to recognition, as if pieces of a puzzle were suddenly falling into place. "A tattoo?" Sarah said, her voice filled with relief rather than judgment. "That's what this is about?" "Marcus, half our office has tattoos. Tom in accounting has sleeves, and Jennifer from HR has that beautiful piece on her back. Why would you think anyone would care about a tattoo?" But Marcus knew they didn't understand. Office workers with decorative tattoos, artistic expressions, or cultural symbols were one thing. Gang tattoos were something entirely different, carrying implications and associations that could destroy careers and relationships. "It's not just any tattoo," he said quietly. "It's from when I was young and made some very bad decisions. It represents a part of my life that I'm not proud of, and I was afraid that if people saw it, they would judge me based on who I used to be instead of who I am now." James Peterson leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. What kind of bad decisions? His question wasn't accusatory. It carried the tone of someone who had lived long enough to understand that people's pasts were often more complicated than their presents suggested. Marcus realized he had reached the point of no return. The partial truth had created more questions, and attempting to retreat now would only make the situation worse. "I was in a gang when I was a teenager," he said, each word feeling like it was being extracted from him. I got the tattoo when I was 18, right after I got out of juvenile detention. It was a symbol of belonging to something that I thought was important at the time, but it represents everything I've tried to move away from. The admission hung in the air like smoke, changing the atmosphere of the room entirely. Marcus waited for the shocked expressions, the uncomfortable shuffling, the polite excuses that would end his career and professional relationships. Instead, he found himself looking at faces that showed surprise, yes, but also something unexpected: interest and even respect. Victoria Peterson was the first to speak. So you completely rebuilt your life? Changed everything about yourself and created a new identity? Her tone wasn't judgmental. It sounded almost admiring. That must have taken incredible strength and determination. How old were you when you made the change? Janet Morrison asked, her supervisor instincts engaging with what appeared to be a management challenge rather than a personnel problem. Marcus could see her mind working, processing new information about an employee she had worked with for years. I started changing when I was 19, Marcus replied, still unable to believe that the conversation was continuing in a civilized manner. It took years. I got my GED, then went to community college, then finished my degree at night while working during the day. I cut ties with everyone from my old life and basically started over from scratch. Sarah's expression had shifted to something approaching awe. That's incredible, Marcus. Do you realize how few people have the courage and discipline to completely transform their lives like that? Most people just accept whatever path they're on and never try to change. Her words carried genuine admiration, and Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the possibility that his past might not automatically disqualify him from respect and acceptance. But even as the initial reaction seemed positive, Marcus knew the real test was yet to come. The tattoo itself remained hidden under his torn jacket, and he suspected that seeing Death's Angel sprawled across his shoulder might provoke very different reactions than hearing about it in abstract terms. The conversation had taken on a surreal quality that Marcus never could have imagined. Here he was, standing in the firm's main conference room with a torn jacket, having just confessed his criminal past to his biggest client and his colleagues, and instead of horror or disgust, he was seeing curiosity and what appeared to be genuine interest in his story. But he knew the hardest part was still ahead of him. The thing is, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength as he realized the world hadn't ended with his confession. The tattoo isn't just any gang symbol. It's pretty intense, and the words that go with it are the kind that make people think of violence and danger. Even though I haven't been that person for 15 years, I was terrified that seeing it would override everything else people knew about me. James Peterson stood up and walked closer to Marcus, his expression thoughtful rather than threatening. Son, I've been in business for 40 years and I've learned that the most interesting people are usually the ones with the most complicated stories. Some of my best employees and business partners have been people who had to fight their way out of bad situations. It builds character and determination that you just can't get from an easy life. The statement was so unexpected that Marcus felt momentarily dizzy. His entire worldview about professional relationships and social acceptance was being challenged in real time. But you don't understand, he said, shaking his head. It says Death's Angel with a skull and wings. It's the kind of tattoo that makes people cross the street to avoid you. Victoria Peterson laughed, a sound that was warm rather than mocking. Marcus, my brother, has a tattoo of a demon on his chest from his military days, and he's now a pediatric surgeon. My best friend from college has Born to Raise Hell tattooed on her ribs, and she's an elementary school principal. People get tattoos for all kinds of reasons when they're young, and they don't define who those people become. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. And honestly, the fact that you've been so careful about it shows how much you've changed. Someone who was still connected to that lifestyle wouldn't care about hiding it. The very fact that you're worried about it proves that you're not that person anymore. Janet Morrison had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke with the voice of someone making an executive decision. Marcus, you've been one of our most reliable and professional employees for 3 years. You've never given us any reason to doubt your character or your commitment to this company. If you want to take off that jacket and finish the presentation, I think we're all adult enough to handle seeing a tattoo, regardless of what it says. The support was overwhelming and completely unexpected. Marcus had spent so many years imagining this moment as the end of everything he had built, that he had never considered the possibility that people might be understanding, or even impressed by his transformation, but doubt still gnawed at him. These were successful, educated professionals who lived in a world far removed from gang violence and street crime. They might think they could handle it, but actually seeing Death's Angel might provoke very different reactions. "I appreciate what you're all saying," Marcus said carefully, "but I need you to understand that this isn't like a butterfly or a tribal design. This tattoo was meant to intimidate people, to mark me as someone dangerous. It worked very well for that purpose when I was 18 and angry at the world. I'm not sure you're prepared for how it looks." James Peterson's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. "Son, I fought in Vietnam and built a manufacturing business in some of the roughest parts of Detroit in the 1980s. I've seen real violence and real danger. I think I can handle whatever you've got on your shoulder." His tone carried the confidence of someone who had faced genuine threats and survived them. "Besides," Victoria added, "we're here to evaluate your marketing expertise, not your body art. The presentation you've given so far has been excellent, and I'd like to hear the rest of it. The tattoo might be interesting, but it's not relevant to whether you can help our company grow its market share." Marcus felt something shifting inside him, a gradual release of tension that he had carried for so long it had become part of his identity. The fear that had dominated his professional life for 15 years was being challenged by reality, and the reality was far different from his worst-case scenarios. These people were treating him like an adult with a complicated past rather than a dangerous criminal in disguise. "Okay," Marcus said quietly, and then louder. "Okay, but I want you to know that I'm the same person I was before you knew about this. The tattoo doesn't change anything about who I am now or how I do my job." He could hear the defensive note in his voice, but he also heard something else. Hope. Sarah clapped her hands together softly. "Of course you're the same person. That's exactly the point. You've always been someone who rebuilt his entire life and became successful through hard work and determination. Now we just know more of the story behind it." Marcus reached up with his right hand and carefully shrugged out of the torn jacket, letting it fall to the floor. He stood in his white dress shirt, feeling exposed and vulnerable, but also strangely relieved. The fabric was thin enough that the dark outline of the tattoo was visible through it, a shadow that hinted at the design beneath. "It shows through the shirt," Victoria observed matter-of-factly. "Has it always been visible like that?" Marcus nodded, realizing that his careful wardrobe choices had been even more obvious than he thought. "So you've been wearing jackets and blazers every single day for 3 years to hide something that probably shows anyway?" The question highlighted the absurdity of his situation in a way that made Marcus smile, despite his nervousness. "Pretty much, yeah. I have a closet full of long-sleeved shirts and blazers. I haven't worn a short-sleeved shirt to work since I started here." "That must have been expensive," James Peterson commented dryly, "and hot as hell during the summers." His practical observation broke some of the tension in the room, and Marcus found himself laughing. "You have no idea," Marcus replied. "I've probably spent more on professional clothing than most people spend on cars, and I've sweated through more business meetings than I care to count." The admission felt good, like releasing pressure that had been building for years. Janet Morrison stepped forward with the kind of decisive energy that had made her a successful executive. "Well, I think we've talked around this long enough. Marcus, if you're comfortable doing it, why don't you just show us the tattoo so we can finish the presentation and get back to business? The suspense is actually worse than whatever reality we're dealing with." Marcus looked around the room at the faces of people who had become more than colleagues over the past few minutes. They had become witnesses to his vulnerability and supporters of his transformation. The moment he had dreaded for 15 years was finally here, and it felt nothing like he had imagined it would. Marcus took a deep breath and began unbuttoning his white dress shirt. His fingers trembled slightly as he worked his way down the front, and he could feel everyone in the room watching him with a mixture of curiosity and respectful anticipation. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed brighter somehow, and he was acutely aware of every sound in the room: the hum of the air conditioning, the faint traffic noise from the street below, the soft rustle of fabric as he pulled the shirt from his shoulders. As the shirt slid down his arms, the tattoo was revealed in its full, imposing glory. The skull dominated the center of his left shoulder blade, its hollow eye socket seeming to stare directly at whoever was looking at it. The wings spread wide across his upper back, intricately detailed with individual feathers that had been shaded and highlighted by an artist who clearly understood his craft. Thorny roses wound around the base of the design, their petals rendered in deep red ink that had faded only slightly over the years. Below it all, in bold Gothic lettering that looked like it belonged on a medieval tombstone, were the words, "Death's Angel." The silence that followed was complete and immediate. Marcus stood with his back partially turned to the group, the tattoo fully visible, feeling more exposed than he had ever felt in his adult life. He had imagined this moment countless times, always ending with shocked gasps, hurried exits, and the destruction of his carefully built reputation. Instead, the silence felt thoughtful rather than horrified. "Wow," Sarah said finally, her voice filled with what sounded like admiration rather than fear. "That's actually incredibly well done. The detail work is amazing." She moved closer to get a better look, her reaction that of someone appreciating craftsmanship rather than being intimidated by symbolism. Victoria Peterson stepped around to see the tattoo from a different angle. "The artistry is really impressive. That must have taken hours to complete, and it's held up remarkably well over the years. The shading technique is quite sophisticated." Her comments were those of someone evaluating art rather than judging character, and Marcus felt some of his tension beginning to ease. James Peterson approached slowly, his experienced eyes taking in the full scope of the design. "I can see why you were worried about it," he said thoughtfully. "It's definitely intense, and it clearly wasn't meant to be subtle. But you know what I see when I look at it? I see someone who was committed enough to endure hours of pain, to mark himself as part of something he believed in at the time. That kind of commitment, channeled in the right direction, is exactly what builds successful businesses." The perspective was so unexpected that Marcus almost turned around in surprise. He had never considered that the very qualities that had made him a dedicated gang member, loyalty, commitment, willingness to endure hardship, might also be viewed as business assets. The idea that his tattoo could be seen as evidence of positive character traits rather than criminal tendencies was revolutionary. Janet Morrison moved around to examine the tattoo more closely, her expression analytical. "Marcus, can I ask you something? When you got this tattoo, what did it mean to you personally? Not what it meant to the gang or to other people, but what it represented for you at that time in your life." The question caught Marcus off guard. No one had ever asked him about the personal significance of the tattoo, only about its implications and associations. "It meant belonging," he said quietly. "I was 18, I had no family support, no direction, no sense of purpose. The gang gave me an identity and a place where I mattered. The tattoo was proof that I was willing to commit completely to something bigger than myself, even if that something turned out to be destructive." "And now?" Victoria asked gently. "What does it mean to you now?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Now it's a reminder of how far I've come, but also of how easy it would be to slip back if I ever stopped being vigilant about the choices I make. It keeps me honest about my past and motivated about my future. I guess you could say it's become less about death and more about rebirth." Sarah made a small sound of understanding. "So it's actually been motivating you all these years, even while you were hiding it. The fear of people seeing it kept you working harder to prove yourself in other ways." Her insight was surprisingly accurate, and Marcus realized that his secret had indeed been a driving force behind his professional excellence. "That's exactly right," Marcus admitted. "I've always felt like I had to be twice as good as everyone else because I knew that if the truth came out, people would judge me more harshly. The tattoo has been like having a permanent reminder that I can't afford to be average or careless." James Peterson nodded approvingly. "That kind of internal motivation is rare and valuable. Most people cruise through their careers on natural talent or family connections. You've been running scared for 15 years, which means you've been giving maximum effort every single day. That explains why your work has been so consistently excellent." The room had taken on an atmosphere of genuine conversation rather than awkward revelation. Marcus found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Standing shirtless in front of his colleagues and clients, his deepest secret exposed, and feeling more accepted than he had ever felt while hiding behind his carefully constructed facade. "Can I ask about the gang itself?" Victoria inquired. "What happened to the other members? Are you concerned about any ongoing connections or obligations? Most of them are dead in prison or have moved away," Marcus replied honestly. "The few who are still around have their own lives now. I haven't had any contact with that world in over a decade. When I decided to change my life, I made a clean break from everything and everyone connected to it. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Janet Morrison looked thoughtful. So you essentially had to rebuild your entire social network along with your career and education. That's an enormous undertaking for someone so young to manage alone. Her tone carried respect for the magnitude of what Marcus had accomplished rather than concern about his past associations. The loneliness was the hardest part, Marcus admitted. I spent years with almost no friends because I was afraid that getting close to people would lead to questions I couldn't answer. I've gotten better at forming relationships, but I've always kept some distance because of this secret. Sarah's expression grew sad. Marcus, you've been carrying this burden alone for so long. How exhausting that must have been. And how isolating. Her empathy was genuine and touching, and Marcus felt emotions stirring that he had suppressed for years. It has been exhausting, he acknowledged, but it also seemed like the only way to protect the new life I was building. I was terrified that one glimpse of this tattoo would destroy everything I had worked for. And instead, James Peterson observed with a slight smile, showing it to us has actually made us respect you more, not less. Funny how that works sometimes. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The very thing he had feared would destroy his professional relationships was actually deepening them. The colleagues who had known him as a competent but somewhat distant professional were now seeing him as a complex human being with an extraordinary story of transformation and perseverance. As Marcus reached for his shirt to put it back on, James Peterson held up a hand. Actually, if you're comfortable with it, why don't you finish the presentation like that? It's warm in here anyway. And I think we've all established that we're more interested in your marketing strategy than your wardrobe choices. The suggestion was casual but carried an underlying message about acceptance and moving forward. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then nodded. The idea of conducting a business presentation shirtless would have been unthinkable an hour earlier, but the entire situation had moved far beyond conventional business protocol. He picked up the presentation remote, which had been forgotten during the revelation, and was relieved to find that it was working again. Where were we? Marcus asked, advancing to the next slide. His voice was steadier now, and he felt a strange sense of liberation standing before the group, without the physical and emotional armor he had worn for so long. The Peterson team settled back into their seats, and the meeting resumed with an energy that felt more genuine and focused than before. As Marcus continued through the marketing strategy, he found himself speaking with a confidence and authenticity that had been missing from his previous presentations. Without the constant mental energy devoted to maintaining his facade, he was able to engage more fully with the material and respond to questions with greater creativity and insight. The tattoo, now visible to everyone in the room, had somehow become irrelevant to the business discussion. Victoria Peterson asked about target demographic analysis for their new product line, and Marcus found himself drawing on experiences and perspectives that he had never been able to access before. His understanding of different social environments, economic pressures, and community dynamics had been shaped by his own journey from the streets to the boardroom, and for the first time, he was able to use that knowledge professionally without fear of revealing its source. Your insights into urban market penetration are unusually sophisticated, James Peterson observed during a discussion of distribution strategies. Most marketing consultants rely on demographic data and focus groups, but you seem to understand these communities on a more fundamental level. Marcus realized that his past, rather than being a liability, was actually providing him with unique qualifications for certain types of business challenges. Sarah took notes throughout the presentation, occasionally glancing at Marcus with what appeared to be newfound respect and admiration. The dynamic in the room had shifted from a standard client presentation to something more collaborative and engaging. The artificial barriers that Marcus had maintained were gone, and the conversation flowed more naturally as a result. When the presentation concluded, the Peterson team spent several minutes discussing the proposal among themselves, while Marcus and his colleagues waited. The verdict, when it came, was unanimously positive. "We'd like to move forward with your firm," James Peterson announced. "The strategy is solid, the execution plan is detailed, and frankly, we're impressed with the level of authentic insight you've brought to understanding our target markets." The contract signing took place the following week, and Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being celebrated for a presentation that had included one of the most unprofessional moments of his career. The story of the torn jacket and the tattoo revelation became part of company folklore, but not in the way Marcus had feared. Instead of being a cautionary tale about maintaining proper business attire, it became a story about authenticity, resilience, and the power of personal transformation. The immediate aftermath of the presentation brought changes that Marcus hadn't anticipated. His relationship with Sarah deepened into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect rather than careful professional distance. She began inviting him to social events, and for the first time in years, Marcus found himself accepting. The constant vigilance about potential exposure was gone, replaced by a sense of freedom that he had forgotten was possible. Janet Morrison called Marcus into her office the day after the Peterson meeting. He expected a conversation about professional boundaries and appropriate workplace behavior, but instead found himself being offered a promotion. "Your performance yesterday was exceptional," she told him. "Not just the presentation itself, but your ability to handle an extremely difficult situation with grace and honesty. Those are leadership qualities, and I want to see how you develop them in a more senior role." The promotion came with increased responsibilities, a significant salary increase, and most importantly, a sense that his career was moving forward based on merit, rather than careful image management. For the first time since starting his professional life, Marcus felt like he was being evaluated for who he truly was, rather than the persona he had constructed. His personal life began to change as well. Without the constant fear of discovery, Marcus found himself more relaxed in social situations. He started dating again, and when relationships progressed to the point where physical intimacy was involved, he was able to share his story on his own terms, rather than living in constant anxiety about accidental exposure. Most people, he discovered, were far more interested in the man he had become than the boy he had been. The tattoo itself gradually became less significant as his story became more widely known. Colleagues who learned about his background were consistently impressed rather than intimidated, and Marcus began to understand that his transformation was genuinely inspiring to people who struggled with their own challenges and limitations. He started speaking occasionally at youth programs and rehabilitation centers, sharing his experience as proof that dramatic life changes were possible with commitment and hard work. 6 months after the Peterson presentation, Marcus was approached by a journalist writing a feature story about successful professionals who had overcome difficult backgrounds. The interview process was initially challenging, requiring him to revisit memories and emotions he had spent years suppressing, but the resulting article presented his story as an example of American opportunity and personal determination rather than criminal rehabilitation. The magazine feature led to speaking opportunities at business conferences and universities, where Marcus found himself discussing not just marketing strategies but also resilience, authenticity, and the relationship between personal history and professional success. The tattoo that had once been his greatest shame became a visual symbol of transformation that audiences found compelling and memorable. Marcus began to understand that his years of hiding had not only limited his professional relationships but had also prevented him from fully appreciating his own accomplishments. The magnitude of what he had achieved became clearer when he stopped viewing it through the lens of shame and started recognizing it as an extraordinary example of human potential and determination. 2 years later, Marcus stood in front of a mirror in his apartment bathroom, the same mirror where he had spent countless mornings adjusting collars and checking for any hint of the tattoo that might show through his clothing. But this morning was different. He was preparing for the most important presentation of his career, not as a marketing executive trying to hide his past, but as the newly appointed director of community outreach for Peterson Industries, a position created specifically for him after James Peterson witnessed the impact of Marcus's authentic approach to business development. The tattoo was clearly visible in the mirror, no longer hidden beneath layers of carefully chosen clothing. Marcus had grown comfortable with its visibility, even proud of what it represented in the context of his complete story. The skull and wings that had once symbolized death and destruction now served as a permanent reminder of rebirth and transformation, a visual testament to the possibility of radical personal change. His apartment had changed too. Gone were the strategic lighting arrangements and carefully positioned furniture designed to prevent accidental exposure. In their place were photographs of Marcus speaking at conferences, receiving awards for community service, and working with young people in programs designed to help them avoid the mistakes he had made. The space reflected the openness and authenticity that had become hallmarks of his new approach to life. The presentation he was preparing for would take place at the city's main community center, in the neighborhood where he had grown up and gotten into trouble as a teenager. Peterson Industries had decided to fund a comprehensive youth development program, and Marcus would be announcing the initiative to community leaders, parents and young people who reminded him of his 18-year-old self. The irony of returning to his old neighborhood as a successful businessman rather than a gang member was not lost on him. Sarah had been instrumental in developing the community program, and their professional partnership had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful. She understood his background completely, and had helped him see how his experiences could be transformed from sources of shame into tools for helping others. Their relationship had taught Marcus that genuine intimacy required the kind of vulnerability he had spent years avoiding, and that the rewards of authentic connection far exceeded the safety of emotional distance. The morning routine that had once been an exercise in concealment and anxiety had become a time for reflection and preparation. Marcus used the time to think about the young people he would meet that day, kids who were facing the same choices and pressures that had led him down a destructive path. His tattoo would be visible to them, and he planned to use it as a conversation starter about consequences, redemption, and the possibility of rewriting one's life story. Janet Morrison had supported Marcus's transition into community outreach, recognizing that his unique combination of business skills and street credibility made him uniquely qualified for the role. The firm had initially worried about losing one of their best client managers, but Marcus's success in building relationships with community organizations had actually expanded their business into new markets and demographics they had never been able to reach effectively. As Marcus drove through the city toward the community center, he passed several landmarks from his former life. The corner where he had been arrested at 17 looked smaller and less significant than he remembered. The apartment building where his gang had conducted business was now a community health clinic. The changes in the neighborhood reflected his own transformation, and he felt a sense of completion that had been missing during his years of hiding and shame. The community center was packed when Marcus arrived. Teenagers sat in clusters, some displaying tattoos and attitudes that reminded him vividly of his younger self. Parents looked skeptical about yet another program promising to help their children. Community leaders appeared, cautiously optimistic but experienced enough to recognize the difference between genuine commitment and empty promises. Marcus's presentation began with the Peterson Industries commitment but quickly shifted to his personal story. He talked about growing up in this same neighborhood, making destructive choices and living with consequences that had shaped his entire adult life. When he rolled up his sleeves to show the Death's Angel tattoo, the room became completely silent. "This tattoo cost me 15 years of my life," Marcus told the audience. "Not because I was in prison or because I was still involved with gangs, but because I was so ashamed of it that I spent 15 years hiding from myself and from other people. I built a successful career and a good life, but I did it while carrying the burden of believing that my past made me unworthy of acceptance and respect." A teenager in the front row, whose own tattoos were clearly visible on his arms and neck, raised his hand. "So you're saying tattoos are bad?" The question carried the defensive edge of someone who felt personally attacked. "No," Marcus replied firmly. "I'm saying that choices have consequences, and some of those consequences last longer than we expect them to. My tattoo isn't bad because it's a tattoo. It's been a problem because of what it represents and because I let it define me for too long. The real issue wasn't the ink on my skin. It was the shame in my head." The conversation that followed was unlike any business presentation Marcus had ever given. Young people asked direct questions about gang life, violence, and the practical challenges of changing course when everyone around you expects you to follow a particular path. Parents wanted to know how to help children who seemed determined to make destructive choices. Community leaders were interested in programs that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Marcus found himself drawing on experiences and insights that his corporate presentations had never required. His understanding of peer pressure, economic desperation, and the appeal of belonging to something powerful resonated with his audience in ways that traditional community outreach efforts had failed to achieve. The tattoo that had once been a barrier to professional success became a bridge to meaningful community engagement. The program launched 6 months later with Marcus as its director. His office was located in the same community center where he had made the initial presentation, and his daily routine now included working directly with teenagers who were facing the same crossroads he had encountered decades earlier. The visibility of his tattoo in this environment was an asset rather than a liability, providing instant credibility with young people who had learned to distrust authority figures who didn't understand their reality. Marcus's story became a case study in business schools and social work programs, demonstrating how authentic leadership required the integration of personal experience with professional expertise. Speaking requests continued to come in from conferences and organizations around the country, and Marcus found himself building a national reputation as an expert on youth development and community engagement. The transformation was complete in ways that Marcus could never have imagined during those anxious mornings in front of his bathroom mirror. The secret that had once threatened to destroy his carefully constructed life had become the foundation for a more meaningful and impactful career than he had ever thought possible. The Death's Angel tattoo remained on his shoulder, but it now served as a symbol of rebirth rather than destruction, a permanent reminder that people could change, grow, and use their past experiences to create positive futures for themselves and others. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sometimes think about the torn jacket that had started everything, the moment when his carefully maintained facade had literally fallen apart in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to him. That moment of forced vulnerability had taught him that authentic success required the courage to be seen completely, flaws and all, and that the relationships and achievements built on truth were far more satisfying and sustainable than anything constructed on concealment and fear.